stocks are continuing to climb as the U.S. and China agree to slash those tariffs for at least 90 days. But as U.S. markets celebrate, our next guest says the agreement could be a bigger win for China. Joining us now, Zongyuan Liu, fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Zoe, thank you so much for being here. So a bigger win for China. Why is that?
Julie, thank you very much for having me. I think this is, in fact, a bigger win for China, not just because basically the Trump administration over the weekend has nearly undone the Liberation Day tariff over China. But then on top of that, it seems that the whole strategy of building allies to isolate China with regards to building a huge tariff wall to separate us versus China, that strategy seems to not be working because China, our tariff on China, the Trump administration's tariff on China now is only 10% higher.
So what comes next, do you think? Because Besson was talking to press this morning and suggesting he'd be meeting with Chinese counterparts again in the next few weeks, kind of iron out a bigger agreement. What do you think the bigger agreement looks like?
Josh, you are right to point out that Secretary Besson mentioned the mechanism, and in fact, in writing in the agreement, they mentioned about the mechanism for continued conversation. Now, here is the trick, right? Although some Trump administration officials frame this as if we have reached a breakthrough, we have reached a deal, but you do not see the Chinese call it this way. The Chinese frame this as we made progress in resolving differences, but the Chinese never said this is a major breakthrough. So going forward, we probably will see continued conversation between the two sides. And now we have 90 days for both sides to figure out what they want and what they are willing to compromise. But ultimately, so far, we still see an asymmetry in terms of governance style. On the one hand, President Trump has featured prominently in media. And then on the other hand, President Xi Jinping has never given any comment about a tariff yet.
So I can't help but wondering what the point of this exercise was. Now, we know it's not done yet, so we don't know what the two sides will agree upon. We don't know what the U.S. will get out of it, but the U.S. initiated this. So what does a best case scenario look like, and does it put the U.S. in a better place than it was on January 1st, say?
I'm afraid, Julie, that I'm not as optimistic because, it is relatively easy to undo the self-inflicted tariff rates, but it is very hard to undo the damage that it has done to America's credibility and perhaps to a certain extent the role of the US dollar, not just in the short term, but also in the long run. Now, the best case scenario for American consumers perhaps would be we return to the pre-Liberation Day tariff scenario, but that is going to take a time. And then the better scenario, the best case scenario for American manufacturers is that through a period of time, and this is going to be a long period of time, that American suppliers, American manufacturers, American industries are able to build an alternative supply chain relatively independent of China. But this is going to take forever. And we simply cannot bring all the manufacturing jobs back to America through tariffs.
Zoe, I'm curious to find out more, get your line of sight on what's going on the ground in China right now. I asked because Kyle Bass, Zoe, posted on X yesterday. Let me read you what he said. He said China came begging to the United States as thousands of Chinese businesses shuttered and failed each and every day over the last few weeks. Factory activity, he says, contracted at its fastest pace in 16 months. Widespread factory closures and job losses. Worker protests have erupted in various regions. I mean, that sounds obviously, he's painting a rough picture, Zoe. I'm curious, does that dovetail with your understanding?
Josh, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of these kind of narratives over the past few months, and even since last year, this kind of a triumphant tariff over China that is going to not just crash the Chinese economy, but perhaps through the crashing of the Chinese economy leading to higher unemployment that is going to destabilize the Communist Party regime. And I think is this kind of overly stated triumphant narrative lead to the Trump administration officials' overestimation of their leverage over China. And in fact, what we are observing now is that this is not a tariff war. This is really about who can endure pain for longer. And guess what? The Trump administration's Liberation Day tariff lasted barely for 39 days, which basically means that from Beijing's point of view, they now have a better understanding of the timing of how long the Trump administration could endure the pain, the pressure from American business, from U.S. domestic constituencies. But on top of that, China has also augmented its series of domestic measures to fight back against U.S. coercive measures, including but not limited to export controls. So overall, I'm afraid that a lot of these triumphant narratives led to the mismanagement of the trade relationship with China. I think it's okay to be tough on China, but you ought to be smart in executing it.
So Zoe, was there indeed, though, protests on the ground in China and this sort of groundswell of protest against the Chinese administration?
Protest. This is really in terms of numbers and scale. And we even during COVID time, people and the media and the social media reported about protest again on Chinese people going on the street, and it has been for a variety of reasons: for zero COVID, for COVID lockdown, for people losing their jobs, for a fire in Urumqi, and now for factory closure, or for people who has not get paid. So people have protested for decades for various reasons, and this is not the first time. And guess what? The Chinese government spent more money on maintaining domestic stability than on national defense. In other words, they understand how to mitigate the domestic risk.